Our 5 annual lectures, each with their own broad theme, bring together many thousands of people each year to take a look at a topic from a humanist perspective. And the Holyoake Lecture is our small p political lecture. It's named, of course, after the 19th century humanist and secularist George Jacob Holyoake. Like Holyoake, who among many other achievements coined the word secularism and was a lifelong political activist jailed for his humanist beliefs and his right to speak freely. The lecture has hosted diverse political speakers over the years from a broad spectrum, including Joan Bakewell, Keenan Malik, Laura Schwartz, Robert Peston, Zion Leitz, Kate Pickett in recent years. And tonight, of course, we're very lucky to have with us Professor Sir John Curtice, who, in spite of needing no introduction, is nonetheless going to receive one. Although you've all seen him, plenty of him in this general election year, certainly, but nevertheless. Sir John is Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University in Glasgow and Senior Research Fellow at the National Centre for Social Research and the Economic and Social Research Council's The UK in a Changing Europe initiative. He's written, of course, very extensively about voting behaviour in elections and referendums, unfortunately, in the UK, as well as on British political and social attitudes more generally. He's been a co-editor of NatSen's annual reports since 1994 and is a regular contributor to British and international media coverage of politics in the UK, including as co-host of the Trendy podcast. You see what they did there with that title? It's very, very good. And as a member of the BBC's election night team. He's a fellow of the British Academy, the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Academy of Social Sciences, and is an honorary fellow of the Royal Statistical Society and the Market Research Society. So please welcome John Curtice as this year's Holyoake medalist and the giver of tonight's 2024 Holyoake Lecture.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for the invitation to give this lecture. And so let's proceed apace. So I guess it's one of those subjects that's reached general public discourse within the last 5 years or so. It perhaps particularly started to become part of the zeitgeist during the COVID pandemic, when there were arguments about some of the Black Lives Matter protests, demonstrations, whatever you want to call them. But certainly, more broadly now, we do talk about something that we call the culture wars. And obviously, before we go very far, I need to define a little bit further about what we talk about. So I think there are 2 aspects to the culture wars debate. First is effectively about the extent to which we should recognize the culture, identity, and the economic position of minority groups, such as people who regard themselves as black, transgender people, and in particular, at least for one side of the argument, recognizing the relative disadvantage that they would argue is suffered by many people who belong to various minority groups. So that's one argument about what we should be doing about equal opportunities for the black people, what should we do about the legal recognition of people who are transgender, what should be our attitude towards same-sex relationships, etc., all of which I'm going to talk about. The second aspect of the culture wars debate is really about attitudes towards Britain's imperial past. It's an issue that Robert Jenrick, one of the candidates for the Conservative leadership, has raised in the last 24 hours, saying that we should be proud of Britain's empire and that the countries that we invaded should be, in a sense, should be grateful for the fact that they were part of the British Empire for at least a period, and that this, in his view, brought them all sorts of potential advantages. There are others, of course, who would now argue that we should be more questioning. I mean, I can see there's some people in this room who are not that dissimilar in age to me, and I can remember, when you were doing geography lessons and you had maps of the world, you had lots of red. Yeah, about half the African continent was in red, and these were places that either were or were not that recently part of the so-called now Commonwealth, then perhaps still the British Empire. And we kind of didn't really question about the fact that this was part of along with the Industrial Revolution, part of Britain's greatest period in its history. We now debate this. So those are the two subjects I'm going to look at. Beyond that, of course, there are then a couple of other terms that are commonly used in this debate, and sometimes are used somewhat pejoratively. So some people who take a critical view of Britain's imperial past, a sympathetic attitude towards the disadvantaged suffered by various groups, they're sometimes regarded as woke. Of course, it's a term that originally comes out of back in the African American community. But then equally those who are on the opposite side of the argument are sometimes described as anti-woke. And I just mentioned that not because they're necessarily particularly helpful, but again, just to help to clue everybody in to what we're talking about here. So that's what I'm going to talk about. How am I going to do it? Well, essentially there are 4 parts to this lecture. The first is I'm going to look at how attitudes have shifted to various particular examples of the subjects that are covered by the 2 strands of the culture wars, some of which I've already mentioned as examples. What I'm then going to do is to shift gear very slightly. So I'm then going to talk about, well, what are the underlying values that people might have that might actually affect their attitudes towards various culture wars issues? And in fact, how do these attitudes differ from other value divides that might also have existed and might perhaps once upon a time be something that we used to talk about rather more? Having done that, I'm then going to look at, having shown that there is indeed a link between a certain set of values and people's attitudes towards some of these specific subjects, and that therefore there is an underlying dimension of attitudes here, is I'm then going to get to the question, well, why have attitudes shifted? I've already given you some clues about the ways in which they might have shifted. And then just in case you thought you were going to get away with a 40-minute lecture from me without any discussion of politics, we will get to the politics towards the end, and about the extent to which indeed the culture wars, or more broadly, perhaps cultural or social issues, however you want to describe them, have now become a dividing line in our electoral and party politics in a way that wasn't once previously the case. I'm, for the most part, going to be using data from the British Social Attitude Survey done by the National Centre for Social Research that Andrew referred to earlier. I've been involved. I know describe myself as the walking museum of British social attitudes because I've been involved in questionnaire design virtually from its beginning. And occasionally when we're having discussions about, well, should we ask, can we think of a question we can ask about X? And I go, I think in about 1990, we've already asked something other about this. Go and look it up. And, and some poor 25-year-old researcher goes, oh, blimey, O'Reilly. Anyway, so exhibit number 1. This is really looking at the second strand of the culture wars debate. This is some data that we renewed again last year. It's asking people how important asking people various aspects of the ways in which they might have pride in Britain. So one of the items, for example, is the idea that I'd rather be a citizen of Britain than any other country in the world. Second is one that and that's the top line. Middle line is people who say Britain is better than everywhere else, and the world would be a lot better place if people were more like Britain. Sorry, that's the third one. And in the middle, Britain is a better country than virtually anywhere else in the world. Now, these are all, as it were, indicators of relatively high pride. People who might think, being British is a really, really good thing, and we should take pride in being British, and the world would be better if we were like it. Now, the extent to which people agree with these things differs, and they always have differ. The notion that people rather be a citizen of Britain is a much more popular notion than the idea it would be better if the rest of the world were like us. We're not that nationalist. But what you will note is that the 2 more recent readings, 2021 and 2023, in each case, the proportion of people who agree with this sentiment is lower than it had been from the 1990s through to 2013. So here is one indication of how we don't necessarily quite buy into a strong sense of British national sentiment in the way that we once might have done. A second thing that doesn't show much change, but is of interest because it doesn't show much change, and I'm going to show you a contrast in a moment. This is now asking people about what are the things about Britain that you take pride in. Excuse me. And here are a couple of examples. One is Britain's arts and literature, and the other is its sport. Both, of course, of which are activities in which, particularly sport, where the diversity, particularly of England's population, is often made very, very clearly manifest, but where we are often, in both areas, often celebrating those who come from what we, broadly speaking, call minority backgrounds. And what you will notice is that, if anything, we are now somewhat more likely to be proud of these aspects of British life than we were 20 years ago. In contrast, well, you're probably not entirely surprised, given recent events and the most recent readings in 2023, that we're not quite so proud of Britain's democracy as we once were. But probably what's more central to what we're talking about this evening is the top line of these two, which is the proportion of people who are proud of Britain's history, which clearly begins to speak, at least indirectly, to this debate about Britain's imperial past. And what you will notice, in contrast to our attitudes towards arts, literature, sport, we are now, and it's within the last 10 years or so, that we have become less likely to say, yeah, of course I'm proud about Britain's history. So we are more willing to question. Another thing that's changed is our conception of what we think the attributes you have to have for you to be regarded as British. What I'm showing you here are three possible things that you might think you need to be in order to be British, which might be regarded as indicators of a traditional, or to use another term, a more ethnic conception, i.e. basically it's something that people who are white and British and have been living here for a long time, and their family's been living here for a long time, might find it easier to meet than, for example, people who are first or second generation migrants. So the top line here is the people say, do you have to be born in Britain? Well, quite a lot of people think it is important to be born in Britain, but the proportion who feel that you have to be born here to be able to claim to be British has gone down. There's also been a bit of decline in the proportion of people who think you have to have got British ancestry, i.e. your mum or dad was born here, or your grandparents, or whatever. And also what's declined, which I guess is of particular interest to this audience, is the proportion of people who think that you have to be Christian to be regarded as British has also gone down. So again, we're less likely to think of the fact of ourselves as once of having been a Christian country. So in all of these areas, in terms of measures of what it means to be British, etc., there's been marked noticed changes in the course of the last 10 years. And the culture wars are picking up something, and in part what I think they're picking up, particularly so far as this strand is concerned, is that we're talking about subjects about which there was once a consensus. Of course, Britain's history is something to be proud of. Of course, this was a Christian country. But that in the course of particularly the last 10 years or so, these notions have been the subject of debate. And in part, therefore, what we're seeing about the culture wars, people say, well, why are we not having a culture wars? Well, it's in part because things that were once basically the subject of consensus are now more likely to be the subject of debate. And that does therefore mean that for certain sections of our society who are, in the, might loosely call the anti-woke camp, they are relatively uncomfortable with the cultural change that's going on. And this perhaps is one of the reasons why debates about cultural issues are going on. But let's then go and look on some of the other things. This is looking now much more at minority groups. Attitudes towards immigration. This is actually going back the last 20 years or so. The blue line are those people who think that people who come to Britain as migrants are good for our economy. The red line are those who think they are bad. You will see one of the fascinating paradoxes of the last decade or so is that since we voted to leave the European Union, we've become much more sympathetic, or at least take much more favourable attitudes to the consequences of migration. Though that said, do note that the very high levels of migration, indeed the record levels of migration that the UK had around 2023, has seen something of a reversal of that trend. But actually, despite what you might think, we are now more favourably disposed towards migrants in terms of their economic impact. The same is also true of their impact on our culture. We are now more likely to say that they enrich Britain's culture. You know, the tikka masala Robin Cook comment, it's got a certain amount of truth to it, those of you who remember that, and less likely to think that it undermines. Though again, a little bit of reversal more recently. Looking more directly at attitudes towards equal opportunities, these are the proportions of people who say that equal opportunities have not gone far enough, minus those who think they've gone too far. Now, you can see in the case of women, we are inclined to think that equal opportunities have not gone far enough, and that's not radically changed, but we were already in that position. So far as gay men and lesbians are concerned, well, we used to be inclined to the view back at the beginning of the century or so that equal opportunities policies have gone too far. We're not still necessarily wildly liberal on this, but we are less likely to hold that view than was the case 20 years ago. And equally, there's a similar pattern so far as black and Asian people are concerned. We are now inclined to the view that equal opportunities have not gone far enough. So again, you can see there is a move in a direction. That's fine, and vice versa for somebody who wants to transition from female to male. But where we have had a debate and where public opinion has actually shifted in what perhaps is the less liberal direction, although this is in itself a debatable way of looking at the issue, because a lot of women would say that's not necessarily the right description. But whatever description you want to use, you will notice that the proportion of people who disagree that transgender people should be able to change the gender on their birth certificate, i.e. to acquire legal recognition, that actually public opinion in the wake of the debate, the relatively recent debate, has actually moved in the opposite direction. It will be interesting to see where this debate goes over the course of the next 10 or 20 years. So, with that one exception, I've given you numerous examples across two strands as to how public opinion has shifted in a direction which we might regard as more woke, as opposed to being anti-woke. So what are the underlying attitudes that might be going on here? Now, I'm going to introduce you to a little wee bit of survey methodology, but only just a little bit. One of the things that British social activists has been doing virtually ever since it began, is including two sets of questions that were designed to get at two fundamental value divisions in our society. This is one of them, originally dubbed the libertarian authoritarian scale, and you can see why, because essentially for the most part, there are items in which if you agree with these items, you're basically saying, you know, we should toughen the law, we should be harsher on criminals, we should have the death penalty, we should be censoring society. It's a relatively authoritarian outlook. But as I'm going to show you, actually, this scale actually captures a much wider range of attitudes. It also captures that division between social liberals, people who are relatively comfortable with diversity, like living in a diverse city like London or Manchester, who feel that it's up to individuals to decide what moral code they follow, what mores they follow, what language they speak, what religion, if any, they follow, as opposed to social conservatives who are saying, well, no, hang on, no, if we're going to cohere a society, then we do need, to some degree, society needs to be able to impose its own moral code. And that we do need everybody speaking English. etc., etc., and that these are crucial foundations for maintaining the social cohesion that's essential to any society. And this is a long-running debate. So this is one set of items that we've got, and which I'm going to use. There's another set of items that British societies that is regularly asked, which is a left-right scale. And it's essentially about the argument about inequality and what the state should do about it. Our politics historically have been about that, and been about that much more than about that, although it's always been a little bit about that, all right? But which of these scales best taps attitudes towards some of the subjects that I've been talking about? Well, let's first of all look at what's been happening to some of the individual items on that libertarian authoritarian scale. Here's a couple of them. One of them here is that schools should teach children to obey authority, and the other one is young people today don't have enough respect for traditional British values. What do you see? Well, in the last 10, 15 years or so, we have become less likely to agree with those things. You can see, once upon a time, there wasn't a great deal of argument about this. All right? Go back to the 1980s, you've got over 80% of people saying that schools should teach children to obey authority. I can remember still my mother saying children are there to be seen and not heard, right? I'm sure some of you in this room, maybe your parents said the same thing. But apparently, now we don't necessarily think that perhaps that's the way that schooling should go. Equally, also, the law should always be obeyed, even if a particular law is wrong. Okay? Blue line is those who agree, red line is those who disagree. Again, quite a sharp change in the last 10 years or so. We are now we're split 50-50 as to whether or not civil disobedience is sometimes okay or not. And indeed, more broadly, if I just take all the items and put them together, on balance, we're still somewhat more likely to be authoritarian. There's a scale from 0 to 100. 100 is authoritarian, 0 is liberal. But you can see how, as a society, we've become more liberal or more libertarian on this scale than we once were. Okay, so what's the link between this trend and these values and attitude? Well, the first thing to understand is, let's just take Brexit as another perhaps aspect of the culture wars. A lot of people, when they talk about this, they say, people on the right voted for Brexit and people on the left voted against. No. Right? I'm now using my left-right scale that I briefly showed you. We weren't talking about inequality in the EU referendum. We were talking about immigration and sovereignty and the economic impacts of being inside or outside the single market. And in fact, if anything, this is data from British sociology, if anything, people on the left, on that left-right scale, were a wee bit more likely to vote Leave than those folk who were on the right. But basically, there wasn't much difference. But if you take the divisions between libertarians or authoritarians or social liberals and social conservatives, then we get a big difference. Liberals/libertarians voted Remain. Social conservatives, authoritarians, voted to leave. And so this was a very, very different division on our society. So Brexit, which in a sense, in some ways, really what has been the issue that's been most politicized in what we might regard the culture wars debate, very, very clearly related to this dimension. As is attitudes towards immigration. People who are social liberals or libertarians are much more likely to think that immigration is good for our economy, are much more likely to think that our culture is enriched by migration. Equally, people who are libertarians are much less likely to say that they'd rather be a citizen of Britain than anywhere else in the world, or that Britain is better than anywhere else in the world, and it'd be better if other countries were more like us. Again, this underlying value dimension produces a very similar pattern. It's also true on attitudes towards equal opportunities policies. It is those who are more authoritarian, more socially conservative, who are less favourable to equal opportunities policies. It doesn't matter what group you're talking about. Even for women, they are less likely to think that equal opportunities policies have not gone far enough. And you can see a particularly sharp division when it comes, for example, to attitudes towards transgender people. So we've now, you can see there's a link here between a lot of these issues and this underlying dimension. And I've also shown you the attitude or the values that people have become more liberal over the course of the last decade. So evidently there is something much more general going on in our society. One of the things that, so I'm now moving on to a little bit about causes, and I'm going to first of all use the value divide to look at some of the possible causes. One of the things that you might imagine, and it's certainly true, is that younger people tend to be more liberal and less authoritarian than older people. This is just all British social attitude surveys since the 1980s. The older folk are the topmost line, the younger folk are the youngest line. And if anything, the gap has widened a little bit. So therefore, we might think that part of the story is, well, basically, older folk who are more conservative are gradually going off to, well, maybe a better place, maybe not, but maybe we shouldn't have that debate this evening. And they're being, being replaced by younger people who are more liberal. And that is certainly part of what's going on. What I'm now doing here is I'm just taking age groups 10 years apart from each other, and I'm showing the difference in 2013 to 2023, according to people's age in 2013. So if we first of all take the far right-hand side, these are the folk who were over 80 in 2013. So quite a lot of them have gone somewhere else, at least, since, and they were relatively authoritarian. On the far left-hand side are the folk who were below the age of 18 in 2013, but who are now probably in their 20s, and they are the most liberal group. So certainly you can see how the process of generational replacement is part of the story. But also note that for each cohort, so the folk who were aged 18 to 29 in 2013, they are, that group, which is now the same group of people, are more liberal now than they were 10 years ago. So although generational replacement is part of the story, it's also the case that as a society, we have also shifted our attitudes. A second thing that's related to this is people's levels of education. As you can see, both in 2013 and in 2023, those people who have university degrees are much more likely to be libertarian, socially liberal, than are those who have little in the way of educational qualifications. And this was also a big divide in the Brexit referendum. And of course, as a society, we are sending more and more people to university. And that in itself is again helping to move attitudes in a more liberal direction, which is why some members of the Conservative Party are not quite so keen on university these days than they might have been 20 or 30 years ago. But again, notice that graduates are now all themselves who are more liberal than they were 10 years ago, as is virtually every other educational group in our society. So again, it's part of the story. And of course, education and age are related because younger generations are more likely to have been to university. And I guess you might have been thinking that this is going to come as well. It's also true that people who are religious tend to be on average, tend to be more socially conservative, although there's a lot of variation around that average. But again, even amongst those who are religious, attitudes have become more libertarian, socially liberal than was once the case. So all of these things are going on. So certainly generational replacement is part of the story. The increase in educational attainment is part of the story. The decline of religion is part of the story. But none of these individually explain things. You've got to put all these things together and also then still recognize that as a society, the debate we've been having about these issues has actually shifted opinion in some instances. And again, I mean, I can show you how some of these demographic differences also occur on some of the individual issues that we've been talking about. So this is back to British nationalist sentiment, And as you can see, younger people are less likely to say that they rather be a citizen of Britain than the rest of the world, that Britain is a better place than elsewhere, and it'd be better if elsewhere was more like Britain. So again, you can see on the individual items, again, the process of age, generational replacement is going to be part of the story. If I take equal opportunities policies and show the differences on those by educational background, so the blue line are the folk who have got degrees, the red line are the folk who have less than an A level, and again, you can see on all these issues, those who have got a university background are much more sympathetic, much more likely to think that the equal opportunities policies have not gone far enough than are those folk who have less in the way of educational qualifications. And then equally, and again, as you might anticipate, those folk who identify at least as with a religion, although it's less true actually of those people who actually practice their religion, but people who identify their religion, I mean, most of them now will, even amongst that group, you've got nearly 60% saying that same-sex relationships are rarely, if ever, wrong. But there's still a minority of folk who identify with a religion who take a different view. So these attitudes are also, the individual attitudes as well as that broad value spectrum are associated with some very clear changes in the structure of our society in terms of education, age, and religious background. So that brings us towards the politics. And our politics have tended to be an argument about inequality and the role of the state. Saw it today. I mean, in a sense, dramatically illustrated. We have a Labour government putting forward a budget that increases taxation, increases spending, is, in so doing, is to some degree at least trying to do things that it thinks it will help to reduce inequality. And we've got the Conservative Party saying this is the Labour Party yet again, increasing debt, increasing taxation, we told you so, this is what they always do. This is just the classic debate about what should be the size of the state, what should the role of the state be, and how far it should intervene in our economy. And this is not voting behaviour, by the way, this is whether or not people identify with the party. I'll come to voting behaviour in a moment. But as you can see, basically speaking, people who are on the left, so the people who agreed with most of those items I showed you earlier on the left-right scale, much more likely to vote Labour than folk on the right, and conversely, people who tend to disagree with the items about more equality are more likely to vote Conservative than those people on the left. It's what you would expect. And this has not really changed very much. But notice what happens if I do the same analysis at the moment by party identification rather than people actually voting, so people saying they're party supporters, do the same analysis for recent years according to whether people are libertarians or authoritarians. Now, in 2016, libertarians were rather more likely to vote Labour than authoritarians, and the opposite was true for the Conservatives. As I said earlier, this dimension has always been there in our politics, but clearly not as big as the left-right divide. But move forward to more recently, and as you can see, that division between libertarians and authoritarians, between social liberals and social conservatives, the woke and the anti-woke brigade, that division has become much more a feature of our politics. But notice the way in which I'm analysing things here, because this is not unimportant. I'm not just comparing Conservative and Labour. What I'm now comparing is the level of support for the Conservatives plus UKIP plus Reform, on the one hand, versus, on the other hand, Labour and the Democrats and the Greens. Because actually the libertarian-authoritarian divide doesn't just structure Conservative and Labour, it does to some degree. It heavily structures Reform. You can guess the direction in which it goes. It also heavily structures the Greens, and you can probably guess the direction in which that goes. And the Liberal Democrats, the secret is in the name, all right? Okay, always has been. So if we then do look at, again, some of the particular issues in the culture wars, you can again see why this has become the way it's become part of our politics. So looking at that item about whether or not migrants enrich culture or not. And as you can see, those people who think that migrants enrich our culture are more likely to vote Labour, Liberal Democrat or Green than are whereas those folk who have the opposite view are more likely to vote for the Conservatives or for one of the Eurosceptic parties. And that divide has increased. So it's not just those hairy-fairy values, it's also these specific issues that are part of the culture wars that are now more clearly related. Indeed, you know, those divisions are beginning to look as big as the left-right divisions. Equally, equal opportunities. Here the divergence is not so great, but you again can still see that even on this issue, people who think that equal opportunities have not gone far enough are more likely to be voting for one of the so-called progressive, quote-unquote, parties, whereas those of the opposite point of view more likely to vote for the Conservatives or UKIP or whatever. And, yep, it's also become part of our politics. The debate about transgender recognition has also become something where back in 2016, when the debate was really just beginning to emerge, frankly, there was virtually no relationship at all between your attitudes towards the legal recognition of transgender people and whether or not you voted for one of the socially conservative parties or whether you voted for Labour or Liberal Democrats or Greens. These are, you know, very, very slight differences. But now, the folk who are supporting Labour, Liberal Democrats or the Greens are much more likely to be people who support the legal recognition of transgender people, whereas the opposite is true of the Conservatives. So again, if you want to understand why some of the issues that have been debated inside the Conservative leadership contest at the moment, well, you know, this is a reflection of a broader reality. It's also true that Brexit has become, and despite the fact that we're not having a great deal of debate about it, has also become part of our political divide, particularly, again, if you think of British politics in terms of the two-party blocs. And indeed, as a consequence of the arguments about Brexit, we are still more divided politically, according to our views about Brexit, than we were in 2016, and that was a measure that was taken just very, very immediately after the referendum. So the polarization of our politics also around this issue, which in a sense was always the most obvious part of the libertarian versus authoritarian dimension, our politics around that has become more divided as well. Okay, but I've shown you about party support, but what about voting behavior? So, let's first of all look at the position in 2019. So I'm already by this point, as you will have seen from the slides I've just shown you, we're already in a world where the politics of the culture wars have clearly become much more embedded in terms of the way in which people support for the parties. 2019 election, of course, is the Get Brexit Done election. Indeed, it's an election in which around 80% of people who at that stage said they would vote to leave the European Union if we had another referendum were voting for the Conservatives, and about 80% of the people who have the opposite view were voting for Labour, Liberal Democrats, Greens, or the SNP. And as you can see, indeed, so far as the Conservative Party at least is concerned, their vote in 2019 was much more clearly tied to whether people were libertarian or authoritarian. The support for the Conservatives was 44 points higher amongst authoritarians than it was amongst libertarians. And that division is much greater than the difference between those on the right and those on the left. The Conservative vote of 2019 was primarily structured by the second dimension, and that is really a consequence of the whole Brexit debate. In the case of Labour, not quite so much, but again, you will notice Liberal Democrats certainly, but that still the division is there. What about 2024? When you might think it's all gone away. Oh no, it hasn't. Now, it's true. It is true that support for the Conservatives, the gap is not as great on the Libertarian Authoritarian division as it was either in 2019 or indeed as it is on the left-right divide. But that's a reflection of the fact that the Conservative Party only got 24% of the vote. So there was no way in which they were going to have a bigger divide. What you should notice is the extent to which support for reform is also so much higher amongst authoritarians than it is amongst libertarians, and that while people who voted for reform are also somewhat more likely to be on the right, for reform, this is really the dimension that matters. So the Conservative Party may not now be carrying the torch for folk of an anti-woke disposition in the way that they were back in 2019, but insofar as they're not doing so, Nigel Farage is making up for the losses. Meanwhile, you will notice that although Labour, for the most part, have tended to row back on these issues, you can see that their supporters are almost as strongly distinguished by the libertarian authoritarian dimension as they are by the left-right dimension. And notice that the Greens, both dimensions matter, but the Greens, together with Liberal Democrats, are also stronger amongst libertarians than they are amongst authoritarians. So it's still there in our politics, and in particular, as you might now guess, if I put the two blocks together, you can see how, so on the left-hand side, you can see how things have evolved. So the first two pairs of histograms is showing the position of the 2019 election. And once you put the two blocks together, the 2019 election is more clearly an election about libertarian versus authoritarian than it is about left versus right. And in 2024, it is at least as much about the culture wars divide as it is about the left-right divide, the traditional divide in our society, the division that once articulated a division between people of different social classes, which of course is the equalities issue about which we now talk a great deal. So, I hope that I've given you some idea as to how the culture wars issue has developed and how it's become both an important source of debate and argument within our society as a result of changing attitudes that often mean that issues that were once a subject of consensus have now become contested. But essentially, as a society, broadly speaking, with the occasional exception like of a transgender, we've become more liberal, and that has helped to be the engine that has produced this so-called cultural wars or arguments about cultural issues. But these are not left-right issues. They're arguments between libertarians and authoritarians, between social liberals and social conservatives. Why is it called? Well, it's to do with the secularization of our society, the spread of university education, and beyond that, if you want to kind of think at a much more mega level, well, why are we sending more and more people to university? Well, because basically nobody's going to pay British worker a fortune to make things because we have very little comparative advantage, with the odd exception. Increasingly, we are reliant on our digital skills, our software skills, our people skills, the skills that come through university education. And, that's the product of the globalization of society. We are increasingly having to focus on where our value added is be. Globalization enforces that process, and that means, therefore, we're sending more people to university. But equally also, what is globalization also producing? It's producing higher migrant flows, and that also helps to provide impetus to the debate about culture wars. Underneath that, then, therefore, it means that we have divides by age, by education, and religion. And particularly age and education, so far as our politics are concerned, are now much more important than a social class. Actually, there is no longer any relationship between whether you vote Conservative or Labour and whether you're working class or middle class. That's completely disappeared. It disappeared in 2019. It has not returned. And that is a very, very different world. The Brexit debate helped to ensure that the cultural divide became politicised. In our case, at least, although a lot of what I'm talking about, you could do the same analysis to the United States, etc., or indeed to many European society. But here, at least, the Brexit debate, because it was a libertarian, authoritarian issue, helped to ensure that the cultural divide became particularly strongly politicised. And intriguingly, however, despite the fact that we haven't been talking about Brexit, other aspects of the culture wars are still there, we're still debating them, and they are still reflected in the politics of our society, not least in the character of the support for the two parties that in effect emerged in the 2024 election, Reform and the Greens. And that does therefore mean that perhaps one of the consequences of the culture wars is that our politics is now two-dimensional. And reflecting two-dimensional politics with a two-party system is a wee bit difficult. And that therefore maybe, where is the culture wars going, or at least one of the consequences of the culture wars, it may be that it's helped laying the foundation for a much more multi-party system in the UK in the future, much as indeed as happened in 2024. So we started off with sociology, but I did promise a wee bit of politics at the end, and there's a little bit of something for you at least to think about.
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating. I'm sure you'll all agree. We're going to have, it looks like, plenty of time for questions. That's good. We can take audience questions here, but also there's the facility to ask questions if you're online. How do you do that? You enter your questions into a chat box, which you can see and we can't. But if you're out there, into the chat box, and then we've got staff in the room who can get at least a couple of questions from online asked here. If you're in the room with us, then there are microphones, and they'll make their way to you if you put your hand up and I point at you. And if you receive a microphone, treat it as you would treat a cornetto. Not literally, don't lick it, but hold it very close to your mouth, because otherwise we don't always pick up the volume that we want to. I have a question. Sorry, I've lost.
That's fine. That's fine. Okay.
I have a question first, though, to take advantage of being in the chair. The age. I have two questions actually. One of them is about this age relation between what you're talking about, and whether or not it means, to stay on politics for a little bit, what it means for the parties that are associated with with the attitudes that the older and therefore the less likely to be around in the near future people are associated with.
The Conservative Party has now woken up to its dilemma, although the dilemma was as apparent in 2019 as it was in 2024. Sure, there's long been, you might imagine, research in political science about the extent to which the relationship between age and voting behaviour, which has always been there to some degree, is a consequence of generational differences, and to what extent it's a consequence of ageing. When Butler and Stokes did the first work on this subject back in the 1960s, they essentially argued that really the reason why older people are more likely to be conservative than younger people is to do with the Grim Reaper, i.e. that the Grim Reaper tended to visit working class people slightly earlier than middle class people, so therefore the social composition of the older groups was affected by differential mortality. Subsequently, James Tilley did work, and he did argue that to some degree there was a bit of an aging process. But all of that said, even if that's true, the age differences, age used to be our kind of, secondary demographic division, whereas it's now become the principal demographic division. And to that extent, at least, the Conservative Party at some point is going to have to persuade middle-aged people, at least, that they're worth going for. And that, sure, I mean, the Conservative Party there are potentially two existential challenges facing the Conservative Party in terms of what they believe in. One, indeed, is the challenge of the culture wars, which I've talked about. The second is illustrated by events today, which is whether or not as a society we have now got an appetite for a bigger state. Now, I'm not going to get into that now, but the point is those are two issues that hang over us, and we have to wait and see as to where things go. Now, of course, it may well be, the transgender debate shows we can't assume that these changes in social attitudes are inevitable. And insofar as they are partly the product debate, we should be careful. But certainly, there is an issue for those who are on the more socially conservative end. That said, there is no guarantee that the parties that might once have commanded the younger generations will continue to do so. Because the group amongst whom Labour actually lost a lot of ground were the very youngest voters, 18 to 24-year-olds, not to the Conservatives, but to the Greens. All right? So the fact that you've got a younger generation, there's a clear warning. You're not guaranteed to keep them because somebody else may be able to come along and trump you.
So to speak.
So to speak, yes. That was not intended.
And then another question, I suppose this might be more of an international comparison, but the picture you've given us is obviously of, two different tribes, and whether liberal or authoritarian or whatever. But how divided, how sharp is that division in practice compared with other parts of the world? Are we polarized with these two sets of attitudes, or are we closer together than maybe?
Well, the short answer to, of course, is that unfortunately we don't have the data that enables us to do the kind of systematic analysis, to do the analysis I've kind of done systematically, comparatively, right? Okay. That said, sure, the differences between Trump and Harris, between Republicans and Democrats, what are the issues they're arguing about? They're arguing about abortion, social issue. They're arguing about immigration, right? Again, part of the culture wars issue. They're also arguing, by the way, about the traditional conceptions of the family. One of the arguments that's going on out there is that one of the reasons why Trump is doing relatively, and it is relatively well amongst black men, is because they're more, particularly those who are religiously active, are more likely to have traditional conceptions of the family, and they kind of like the fact that Trump is rather more traditional on these things. And of course, religion plays a much bigger role in US society than it does here. It's almost the one advanced industrial society where religion has not really declined. So, and those issues are, in terms of the content of the debate, it's primarily cultural issues that are dominating, and equally, therefore, you've seen, so the Conservative Party has moved from this party that, for example, if you go back 30 years, will be more popular amongst graduates than it is amongst non-graduates because of the class relationship. Now, that's no longer true. Equally, Trump is now more popular amongst non-college graduates than he is amongst graduates. And again, that reflects the relationship between education and attitudes towards cultural issues is pretty widespread. And equally, of course, the European Union, migration, again, the cultural issue is, again, it's part of the advance of the so-called radical right parties. Though the one difference is that whereas here, as I've said, there's a very clear relationship between age and willingness to vote for what we might want to call loosely the right or the non-progressive end of the spectrum. In many Western European countries, younger people are also attracted, and of course, and that therefore, in that case, they're picking up the economic discontent of a generation that are wondering whether they really are going to be better off than their parents. That's not happened here, at least not yet.
Not yet. Okay then, right, now, who has been brewing up a question while this has been going on? Right, oh, there's plenty, don't worry, you're all going to get in. Yes, you first on the edge there, on the end, with a stripy top all the way around, and the black glasses, and the circular zip.
Towards the middle there.
Towards the middle.
Middle on the right. That's
Middle
what
on
we
the
used to
right.
say.
Sorry, middle on the right, yeah.
Hiya. I'd be interested to know, you've spoken about university and education and aid on the effect of cultural wars. What about the press and media and social media? What can you tell us about that?
Short answer, not a great deal. Slightly longer answer, if you think the Daily Mail is effective, Daily Mail influences people, it's not had much impact, has it? I mean, basically, social attitudes have been moving in the opposite direction to those that are promoted by, loosely speaking, the so-called tabloid right-wing press, right? And of course, in some instances, those press have changed their attitudes, particularly towards same-sex relationships. In the end, we've always had the partisan newspapers. Surprise, surprise, once some of these issues become part of our politics, surprise, surprise, we get different views being expressed in different kinds of newspapers. We, of course, more broadly, have a broadcast media that, with the possible exception of GB News, is still very much adopting an impartial view of the world. And what I would say there is that basically, media certainly reflect changes in social attitudes, right? So, Brookside had the first lesbian kiss on television, right? Okay. And again, another item more recently, I didn't get into the monarchy, but again, it's arguably another part of this story. Notice how, although the BBC still tend to be quite reverential towards the monarchy, notice how now, because at least there is a notable minority of our society which do question the monarchy, the BBC do now put spokespersons from Republic into stories sometimes about the media. And we had that at the time of the coronation. So I think, to be honest, and, we've seen our media, I'm older, if you go back to the 1970s and 1980s, you did not see, or very, very rarely saw, openly gay people appearing in the media, etc., etc. We now go, what's the difference? So, I would say to you, you can rail against the Daily Mail and the Daily Express or whatever, but much more broadly, in the end, our media are a reflection of changes in social attitudes. Media become one of the mechanisms through that debate takes place, okay? And of course, there are diverse views, but I think it's difficult to argue that there is some great barrier there towards the spread of more liberal attitudes.
Thank you, yeah.
I'm guessing slightly where you were coming from there, by the way, which you're quite at liberty to challenge, but anyway.
You'll be glad to hear you can still blame the Express and the Mail. You've been given permission by John Curtice.
First of all, I think there was an earlier lesbian kiss than the famous one in Brookside, but I can't remember when it was.
All right, okay.
But if I find it, I'll pass it on.
Sure.
I was prevented from giving a paper in Shanghai in 1989, a little before Tiananmen Square, because it contained an old aim of the Slade School of Art in London, which was to learn from yesterday, to make decisions today, to change tomorrow. Mm-hmm. I think I agree with what you suggested, that we should have a more proportional means of election in this country.
I wasn't getting into that.
I said you suggested.
No.
But I do believe that we should move to a more proportional system. Mm-hmm. And I'd be interested to know what you think the results of this would be if we did become more proportional in our election methods, or if we don't.
Thank you.
Well, the short answer too is I think it's all too easy to exaggerate the impact of changing the electoral system on how people are going to vote. As somebody who lives north of the border, and where we had proportional representation introduced for the Scottish Parliament in 1999, and indeed for local elections in Scotland in 2007, the Liberal Democrats thought this was going to open up heaven to them. Made very little difference. to the willingness of people to vote for them. And equally, we have just seen, 42% of people who turned out to vote in 2017 vote for parties other than Conservative or Labour. So I think, certainly, of course, what will be true is it will change. And the one change that's happened in Scotland, proportional representation has given the Greens a role that they might not otherwise have had, and particularly because of the particular character of the proportional representation system. But if we do end up changing our electoral system, it will be a reflection of a change that's already happened, at least as much as something that's going to push it in a particular direction. And that's without expressing any views as to whether it's a good idea.
I think because New Zealand's a good example. They changed their electoral system relatively recently. It hasn't had much impact on how people vote or the
Yeah, there's been some fracturing of the party system in New Zealand. Yeah, sure.
Right now, here, and here. Don't worry, you've all been seen.
Thank you for a fascinating lecture, and it's great to see you in person as well, not just on the telly.
Yeah, it's not just not just a boss on the television.
On the telly. My question is about really how we've moved towards a service economy of late. I think 80-odd%
Sure.
of what we do is in that sphere. Do you think that has impacted on these trends that we've seen?
Yeah, well, insofar as I suggested that we are running an economy where we essentially need high levels of educational attainment, which a lot of the service industries do. Obviously, there's a difference between hospitality and the provision of corporate lawyers, for example. But it's the latter end where our comparative advantage tends to lie, and therefore, why in the end has the state fostered, albeit not necessarily paid for, the expansion of the university system from being what, even when I went in the 1970s, was a still pretty elite system of a relatively small proportion of a generation to where now, around a half of people from a educational background now go to university. And of course, the fact that it is 50-50 does actually ironically now make it much more of a social division. Because, the other thing that's happened, the days when you could, for example, join a newspaper at age 16, right? You've done your maybe you got the odd CSE, and you're taken on, sorry, does everybody know what I mean by a CSE? Yeah, right, fine, yeah, okay, right. You're all of a certain age in this room. And you might have had a few of those, and you've taken on as a T-boy, right, in the newsroom. But you begin to show a bit of initiative, so you get allowed to go out and maybe do the odd boring court case. Oh, this guy can write quite well, or this lass can write quite well. So maybe 10 years on, you get taken on as a journalist. And then, maybe 15 years after that, you edit a newspaper. All right? That career path is now virtually gone. Even if you do leave school at the age 16 and show, unusual promise, quote unquote, you'll be told to go and get a degree, because journalism has become a degree. So as a society, we become much more credentialist, to use the jargon. So qualifications matter more to people's ability to get on in life. Working your way up through the ranks has become much more difficult. And to that extent, that also then helps to mean, it also means that education becomes a bit of a greater division in our society as well. So on the one hand, it's moving us in a certain direction, but it also helps to create a social division in a way that probably wasn't so much the case in the past.
Right. Yep.
Hello. I'm 62, and I'm a gay man.
You're young by my standards.
Thank you. And obviously you've used gay rights quite interestingly as a kind of weather vane for some things.
Sure.
I've obviously seen an enormous amount of social change and
Sure.
legal change in my life.
Of course.
The news you've given me today is good news. It's that things are becoming more liberal. because my concern is not only selfishly for gay rights, but across the board, rights for all sorts of other people are in a good position. And yet, before I walked in this evening, my sense was that the Overton window was sort of moving to the right, and that actually I'm getting more worried that we're going to lose things that we have fought for so hard.
Well, you see, I think that's why I'm suggesting to you that the reason why we're having the culture wars is because we are now having a debate about issues we didn't previously debate about. Now, I think the honest truth is, so far as gay rights is concerned, it's happened, right? We now have equal marriage. We have equal civil partnerships. It's just stopped for virtually everybody being an issue, right? But more broadly, the fact that we're arguing about cultural issues, it's actually an indication. I mean, part of my argument is that at least some of the culture wars issues are an indication of liberalization of society. I mean, even on transgender, right? Okay. Now, sure, so far at least that debate has moved against those, at least on the legal recognition issue. But the point is, go back 10 years, we weren't even talking about it, right? Okay. So the fact that it's now become an issue of debate is in itself, I don't know if there's anybody who is transgender, but as it were, the good news for you is that at least we're now talking about you and we're discussing the issue. And as I said more broadly, actually, there is very clearly a division between the social recognition and the legal issue. There is and the reason why the transgender thing is arguably somewhat different is that, to be honest, if you give equal opportunities to gay men and lesbians, it doesn't really affect equal opportunities for women, all right? Or if you give equal opportunities for people who identify as black or Asian, it doesn't make much difference to gay men and lesbians. In some people's view, of course, and this is why it's a somewhat different issue, giving equal opportunities for transgender people potentially cuts across the pursuit of equal opportunities for women. Although one of the ironies of the whole debate is that, as has long been the case about same-sex relationships, women are more liberal on transgender than are men. It is often men who are worried about female spaces. Paradox.
The mic's making its way to the back, but can I just ask a question, jumping off from that one?
Sure.
About the role of, as you say, like the debate is over, we've got marriage, the role of the law and so on. Because it was really noticeable that the point at which your line on the acceptance of same-sex relationships being always right or whatever jumped up the year after marriage was introduced,
Yes.
So
Yes.
was the law leading that
Oh,
change?
yeah. I mean, I think the point is it was a brilliant piece of politics in the sense that basically the Tony Blair's government legislated for civil partnerships at literally the point at which as a society where we're switching from, on balance, being unsympathetic to on balance being sympathetic. So it was a perfect piece of political timing because it was going, as it were, it rode the crest of the wave, and then it helped to give it new force. Because, of course, once we had the legal recognition, we had much more in the way of people being openly recognized. And again, thinking about where we were until 1967, until 1967, we criminalized men, right, in that situation. So, but it's equally also, and I hope you will forgive me for saying this, it's also the fact that the change is so different is why I think sometimes perhaps we need to understand why perhaps some people have not, albeit now a minority of people, who have not necessarily accommodated themselves to what is a very substantial social change. So in other words, we are now arguably somewhat too ready to decry homophobic and to use it as a term, as a pejorative term, rather than perhaps being willing to engage in the debate. Because just remember how much things have changed, albeit at the same time always being clear that, of course, one of the problems with some people's attitudes is that it is potentially harmful to other people. And that's my, in a sense, liberal position on the issue.
And if we compared that with something like gender recognition, so that's gone in the other direction though, because
Yeah.
obviously it was 2004 that the law changed to allow people to have their birth certificate changed, but that's actually got worse. So is that the debate probably not happening? The debate didn't happen.
Well, it is, of course, because we were looking to liberalise the view on legal recognition, and it's how that played out in Scotland and how that it got caught up in the whole argument about a certain transgender prisoner, etc., etc. But that also, you know, there is a body of opinion out there, particularly articulated by some women, you know, who take the view that if you legally recognise transgender women, and you then therefore and you then start including them in the statistics on, you know, wages or salaries by gender, you are going to muddle the statistics from that point of view. And again, you know, there are issues about, you know, female toilets, etc., etc. It's a whole. I mean, there's a debate out there about whether or not we need to gender our toilets.
So there's a range of debates.
Right? There's a whole range of debates going on there. But,
all right.
but you can see why it becomes a point of argument. I
Yes.
mean, it may well be that one of the things that happens as a result of this debate is that in 20 years' time we stop gendering toilets.
Yeah.
Kemi Badenoch, by the way, is very, very keen that we gender toilets. And again, that's where the debate's partly going on.
All right. And we are now reaching the point where not everyone whose hand has now been up will get their question asked, but I do have the order in my head of when people put their hands up. So just trust me on this. Yeah. And we've got one online after you, and then we're coming to the woman at the back there.
Hello. I hope you took yourself on a lovely holiday. I was exhausted just watching the election coverage. I'm sorry to wander a little off topic, but if I've got a chance to ask Professor Curtice, I'm going to for a US presidential election prediction. Sorry.
Oh, we were saying about this. Okay.
Okay, a very, very short answer. Nobody knows, but the odds have probably tipped very slightly in Trump's direction in the last week or so.
Oh, well, thanks for that. Great question.
You did ask.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Right.
And as you might have discovered, I'm inclined to give honest answers.
Outrageous. Okay, one from online then, given that they're out there in the ether.
So from online, Benjamin asks, how stable do you think this new political system is? Will the political divide be about culture wars in the 2030s? Or, I suppose, is the thing that will be the political divide culture wars in the 2030s?
Well, it depends on how I mean, I suspect the answer to you is that, yes, we are going to continue these culture war debates for a while, because a lot of the issues are more complicated. And, you know, we've only really just started debating the question of what is our attitude towards British history and the imperial past, and what, if anything, should we do about it, etc., etc. And, you know, that debate's not going to stop, but I'm not sure it's going to get resolved anytime soon either. You've seen how long it took for attitude. It's a big social change, but you know it's a big social change that took 40 years to happen in terms of attitudes towards same-sex relationships. So I don't think I necessarily believe that all of a sudden these things are going to get resolved, but that it looks as though we are, in the meantime, also going to have these issues as part of our politics.
Is the imperial question, is that one that's growing in sort of salience with people, or are we only at the start of that? You're implying we're just at the start of what?
I think we're probably only just at the start of that debate, aren't we? I mean, it really only began to start with the statues during the pandemic and some of that, but it's been about a little bit before. But you know, it's partly internal, it's partly particular. You know, we've now got highly regarded historians from a minority background historically, as opposed to, you know, traditionally historians in this country tended to be rather conservative and public school educated, etc., etc. And they have come with a different perspective. And obviously also there's international pressure about, hang on, you did us an awful lot of damage, etc., etc., at least in our view. So both those things are helping to push the debate in a way that it wasn't there before.
Yeah, it's you, yeah. You had your hand up very early on. Yeah, there we go.
Hello, thank you. One of the things that I think is interesting when you talk about the libertarian and authoritarian side, and I'm guessing that the authoritarian side are more pro-obeying the law and not disobeying laws.
Oh, yeah, sure, absolutely, yeah, integral.
So I wonder why it is that when I've been on like anti-Brexit marches, there's hardly any police and they're really glad to be on that march, including one with about 1 million people, and then 300 kippers march in just after the Brexit thing, and the police were absolutely out in force. Whether you're looking at January in America, January the 6th, when they stormed the White House, or you're looking at the recent riots, why is it that people who would probably identify as authoritarian are so much more likely to riot and break the law?
Well, can I just very very gently point out that the previous riots in 2011, which were triggered by the killing by the police of a black man in Tottenham, did come from the other end of the spectrum, at least originally. I'm afraid there is no monopoly of virtue or vice in our society.
It's a very somber, Quakerly sort of message for this place. Yeah. This may be our last one. I know.
Thanks, John, for a fascinating talk. Yeah, I just wanted, perhaps related to the last question, to relate it to identity politics. I'm not actually use that word, but that all seemed to have grown from about the 1990s or the noughties and came out of postmodernism and so on of the 70s. But that seems to me to sort of be increasingly divisive. We divide people into every category now. And perhaps that's had some benefits along the way, but it also seems to be, I think, negative in some ways. And at least the old left-right debate was about class. And I think class is the biggest thing that affects people's position or chances in society. I just wonder whether you think we'll ever go back to that kind of debate about class.
I think the reason why the culture wars debate seems to be more divisive, more polarized, is that arguably it's more difficult to reach an accommodation between the various sides, all right? One, and two, it is about who people think they are, and there is an emotional aspect to that. Whereas, of course, without getting into too much into the history of this, but of course, a lot of class politics has been about the ways in which the state has reached an accommodation with those from a working class background, and to some degree have ensured that maybe capitalism operates in a somewhat less unequal fashion than would otherwise be the case, and that social democratic parties have played a role in that, and to that extent at least, and as also because of economic growth, you've been able to pay something of a positive sum game. Whereas if it's about identity, and at the end of the day, either same-sex relationships are legal or they are not, right? Okay, and just to take that example, so to that extent at least, it becomes a zero-sum game.
Right.
Right, and that is arguably perhaps why some of these issues, for so long as they are a source of dissensus, are more difficult to resolve, and why we can often see a strong polarization. I mean, clearly on transgender, there's one group of people who very, very honestly believe one opinion, and there's another group of people who very honestly believe another opinion. Frankly, in the middle, there are a lot of people who go, this is a wee bit difficult, I'm not quite sure, but you can see the polarization for those for whom it becomes something emotionally and cognitively important to them.
Right.
So that's why I think these become much more divisive issues.
Right, we've got two more. We're going to take balcony and then the guy in the orange hoodie in the corner, and then that will be our lot.
Thank you very much, John. I'm up here. Can I invite you to dig down into a bit of detail in two areas? One is religion, and the other is the libertarian-authoritarian spectrum. As I suspect that underneath the broad brush, there are all sorts of different dynamics going on in those groupings. There is no such thing as the religious vote. It doesn't all move in one particular direction or another. I suspect, but I'd like to hear your view on that and your interpretation. And the other is libertarian, authoritarian. Is it possible that there are some people expressing views which are libertarian in relation to their own interests, but authoritarian in relation to everybody else?
Thank you. And, right, we'll take that and then we'll come
Yeah, well, I mean, on the latter point, you know, it comes partly back to the question earlier about the policing of demonstrations, right? We're inclined to, we all have a tendency to want the rules to be applied toughly to those whom we don't like, and we want them to be applied sympathetically. And we had this debate during the pandemic because basically there was a tendency to allow the Black Lives Matter type demonstrations to take place, even though arguably on a strict interpretation, perhaps these were things that were rather more social gathering than in general we were permitting. Where clearly there's a whole debate at the moment in our society, and again without getting to this, about, you know, whether or not the pro-Palestinian marches are or not provocative, and whether they should be policed more tightly, etc., etc. One of the failings of the human condition is that we don't necessarily divorce our attitudes towards process from our attitudes towards substantive implications. We're always like a process if we like the substantive implications. To go back to your first point, well, I'm not going to go to a whole long lecture about religion and politics in this country, which is a long subject. Now, of course, there isn't such thing as a religious vote. I mean, just look at the last election. Hindus swung to the Conservatives, and Muslims swung away from Labour towards independent candidates. And certainly, I mean, on the issues I was talking about, it is a bit more complicated. I mean, clearly, some religious groups are more liberal than others, all right? And also, actually, one of the things which is true, I talked about the relationship between identity and attitudes towards some of these things is often more straightforward than the relationship between religious practice and some of these things. People who are regular attenders of religious service tend actually sometimes not to be as socially conservative as the occasional attenders. Okay.
Great. Last question.
Thank you. Thank you for tonight, John. It's a privilege to be in the room with such a massive brain. So thank you very much. I don't know
where is it? I haven't seen it recently.
This might be an appropriate last question, possibly, because I think it maybe underpins a lot of what you talked about tonight. I'm interested to hear your opinion about the ballot box and people's propensity to vote at all, and whether you think you see any trends in that, and whether you see any big winners or losers from that point of view.
Yeah, short answer to, because we are almost at the witching hour, is that it's become more difficult to persuade people to turn out and vote. They need to be given more motivation. They need to be given more stimulus. One of the problems at the last election is they weren't given much of a stimulus because A, the polls said it was all over by the shouting. B, there wasn't that much difference between Labour and the Conservatives in their avowed stance. C, none of the party leaders excited anybody apart from Nigel Farage. And D, we have low levels of trust in politicians. You know, that's just a perfect storm. But on the other hand, give people a reason to vote and they still will vote. You know, I just cite the 85% turnout in the Scottish independence referendum. Give people an existential question such as, which state do you want to be part of? Yeah, they'll still come out and vote. But the point is, we have to have now more stimulus. And in 2024, the stimulus was relatively weak.
Well, thank you so much for so many fascinating questions. It's great that we've got such a large number of them in there, and of course, the answers too. Any of you who are not yet members or supporters of Humanist UK through some absence of the mind that you're desperate to remedy, please remember to do so. Tonight has been a fascinating event, as we all, I'm sure, legitimately expected. It's been wonderful, given us a lot to think about. It's my pleasure to thank John for his lecture tonight, and more broadly for his work over many decades examining the British public under a microscope, as we deserve to be examined. It's only, of course, by knowing ourselves that we can ever hope to change and grow. And John is one of those who's done more than most to shed a light on who we are. And so we're delighted, therefore, to present him with this year's Holyoake Medal. Please join me in congratulating him.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you very much.